We have breaking news and sad news to report here on CBS Sports HQ. I'm Chris Hassel, and sad to pass along the news that record-setting Hawaii quarterback Colt Brennan has died at the age of 37. Rewrote the record books in college football some 15 years ago with those great Hawaii Rainbow teams. Really a culture changer there. He was a Heisman finalist in 2007 when he took Hawaii all the way to the Sugar Bowl to take on Georgia, an undefeated regular season. And then he was drafted by Washington in the 6th round of the 2008 NFL draft. Still first all-time in completion percentage, completions, and tied for first in 400-yard games. One of the most prolific quarterbacks in college football history. Let's bring in our Dennis Dodd, who is close with Colts college coach June Jones. Dennis, what more can you tell us about this unfortunate news out of California today?
Yeah, just a really sad day in the islands. I had just spoken to June Jones, as you mentioned, and part of the legacy here is that, you know, we talk about all the offense and everything going on these days, but June Jones was, up until the time of his retirement, one of the greatest, you know, legacies of Miles Davis, the old run and shoot offense. And that's basically what Hawaii did before the spread had really taken hold. And they went 12-0 in that 2007 season where he threw for over 5,000 yards and then, as you mentioned, got beat up pretty good by Georgia in the Sugar Bowl. But I think that's part of the legacy. And the other part was, you know, he had some personal demons, Chris, in his life throughout the years. And I think that was part of this as well. He was with, I believe, his parents at the time in Oceanside, California. He'd come from that great high school program in Santa Ana, California, modern day, where Matt Leinart won the Heisman, John Hewart won the Heisman. And, you know, his name is up there, too, as one of the all-time greats. At Matt Barkley, I should mention as well, at Santa Ana High School there, where modern day was. But in the end, he brought glory to the islands. This is 4th all-time in touchdowns accounted for, 146, 6th all-time in passing yards, over 14,000. But part of that legacy, Chris, is, you know, in January of 2004, I think people forget this, he was accused of going into a woman's dorm room and eventually got convicted of felony burglary and trespassing. Actually served a week in jail, went to a JUCO in California, did well there, and then bounced back to Hawaii, where I want to come back and mention the glory to the islands. When you succeed and you're from the islands or you do it in the islands, you know, you're good for life. Think about all the heroes there, Tua Tagovailoa, some others. And I think that's how he'll be remembered, the greatest season ever in Hawaii football.
And well documented that he was in a car accident in 2010, suffered a traumatic brain injury, which forced him to shut down his NFL career. You mentioned some personal demons that he was facing all throughout his adult life. But we'll remember him as just an incredible college quarterback. The iconic picture, I think it was in the 2007 season when he dyed his hair blonde, and then he had the Hawaii, there it is, the Hawaii Islands dyed in black into the side of his head. You touched on it briefly, but what did he mean to the state of Hawaii?
It gave, you know, a very proud state, a state that values its heritage. He gave it meaning around the world, in the States, obviously, because of what he'd done. And I remember every time he'd have an interview after the game, he'd give some salute to the islands. You know, he'd say aloha or something like that. And when he did have those islands carved into the side of his head, that was the ultimate salute. I mean, you have to understand, you know, those islands out there, to have a guy in 2006 finish 6th in the Heisman voting and then finish 3rd in the Heisman voting in 2007 and do what they did, win all their games in the way they did, it was amazing. And not being from the islands, but again, once you succeed there, you're part of the culture there, and that's how Colt Brennan will be remembered.
There's 58 touchdowns in 2006. It was a record that stood up until a couple of years ago when Joe Burrow broke that record. Where does Colt Brennan fit in college football history?
You know, Until today, I hadn't really thought of that. You got to think of him as one of the single season all-time greats because of that. He still holds the record for most 400-yard passing games in a season, the most games between him and the receiver Devontae Best, if you remember him. 39 times they hooked up for touchdowns alone. That's a record. So you've got to think of him in terms of one of the all-time greats, and in terms of a thrower, in terms of a quarterback. That Joe Burrow, you remember, he needed 15 games to beat that record, and with 5 touchdowns in the championship game, he got to 60. Well, Colt Brennan got his 58 in 13 games. So, a little more per average there. So he's got to go down in college history, alone being one of the top 5, 4th all time in passing yards.
I've seen a lot of tributes and memories on social media today from people who remember what it was like back in 2006 and 2007 with this nationally ranked Hawaii team playing so late at night. I mean, Dennis, it always gave us something to look forward to at the end of the night on Saturday when you knew that Colt Brennan and Hawaii were going to be on, at midnight or 1 a.m. Eastern time.
Yeah, it was a ratings winner when most of us would be in bed. Or people would wait until Sunday morning or record the games to see it. It was always a shootout. And I just saw a tweet today from one of his former teammates, and I'd forgotten this, that we just mentioned all those accomplishments. He had more than a chance to come out after his junior year in 2006 and turn pro. And I remember him making the statement, no, I want to come back and do more. And he did come back, and that showed that loyalty. And that team, which was, I don't want to say senior laden, but a lot of experience, came back together and did what they did. They wouldn't have been able to do that had Colt Brennan left early for the draft. And that, again, you talked about the legacy of the Islands. That will always be remembered, that loyalty.
How about paving the way for the group of 5? Obviously in the same conference as Boise State, and they did amazing things around this time as well. But Hawaii beating Boise State in 2007 to win the conference championship, then going on to the Sugar Bowl. What kind of impact did they have on kind of setting us to this course of now an expanded college football playoff, which is likely on the horizon?
Yeah, they didn't seal the deal. That was the only thing. They beat Washington at the end of the year in 2007, 35-28 for a Power 5 win. But the showing in the Sugar Bowl, I covered that game that night. They were completely outclassed, 41-10. And that was a very good, Georgia team. That going in, that was the discussion. Can Hawaii hold its own against Georgia? And that's what keeps them from being maybe the best group of 5 team in the BCS era since '98. It still has to be Boise because of what they did the previous season in beating Oklahoma. But that would have been close had they been able to pull that off against Georgia. And I think he only threw for 168 yards in that game and 3 touchdowns. And it was just unfortunate. But that team did not lack for bravado, for competence, for bravery. They went into that game absolutely thinking they could win.
One of the most prolific passers in NCAA history and a Hawaii son. They will always remember Colt Brennan for what he did for those islands. Just a tragic story. Colt Brennan dead at the age of 37. Dennis Dodd joining us here on CBS Sports HQ. Colt Brennan, boy, made so many memories throwing that football around in Honolulu for Hawaii. Passed away yesterday at the age of 37. His family says he passed away peacefully, surrounded by his family.